Lusophone writing. And this is obviously an interest that Marcello and I share, and he'd been gracious enough to read an earlier book of mine. And then we've just kept in touch and came up with this idea and felt that, I mean, given our strange global circumstances now, which really is affecting us all in different ways, and currently especially seriously in India, we felt that this is one way of sort of combating this sense of isolation that the current situation is producing in us all. And want to keep things very simple, but we received a very enthusiastic response to our call for papers, and this means that we will in fact be having 2 workshops, and the second one is scheduled for Thursday the 23rd of September, and we'll be sending out more information about that later on. And today we're having like 2 sessions, and we will try to have a short break after the first one because we need that. And Jean-Marie will be chairing the second, or moderating the second session. I suggest that introductions are kept to minimum, but that speakers introduce themselves. That's the easiest way to do this. But Marcello, would you like to add anything?
No, I just want to say thank you for the generosity and the dialogue that we have recently. I think everybody, the moderators and speakers who accepted with enthusiasm this event, and just would like to express my solidarity with all of you who have lost someone, a colleague or a friend or a family member. It has been hard days, especially for fellow Brazilians and everybody in the world, but especially Brazil, India, and some United States also. So just want to say that and thank you all.
And I can also add that this sort of Sao Paulo Stockholm collaboration is a very unusual one. It's not an axis that is particularly common. That makes it all the more inspiring, and also allows us the opportunity to include the Lusophone literatures in a wider discussion of literatures of the world today. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first moderator, Paulo Horta.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Can you hear me? Okay. I myself, being from Brazil, my family's all in Brazil, and I have good friends in India. So I am very much mindful of the situation that we're in. I would like to just thank Marcello and also Stefan. These kinds of other ways of rooting intellectual exchange are so vital. So I'm really happy to be part of this. And without ado, the speakers are introducing themselves. So we will begin with Josefina from the Universidade de Lisboa, and each speaker has 15 minutes. And please feel free to bug me via the chat icon. There must be a way of sending group and private chats, I imagine, as on Zoom. It is nice to sometimes accumulate questions, so you can send them to me, and that way we won't start from nowhere, from nothing when the moment arrives. Pause up, por favor.
Well, hello everybody. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you so much for having me here. My name is Josefina. I'm from the University of Lisbon and from CLEPUL. It's our research center. I'm here with a colleague, Marco Bucaioni, who works with me. The work that I'm presenting is part of some of initial ideas of a project that we have. The project is called AfroLab, and the description is institutions and consecrations inside and outside the Portuguese language space from 1960 to 2020. This is a massive project that we are beginning. This is actually the first time that I'll be publicly addressing some ideas of the project. So these are all some primary ideas, and I'm very glad to be able to share with you, and of course to talk them through here and hear your suggestions and everything, because we are beginning our research, and these are some first thoughts. So I have a PowerPoint to share, but I don't really know how can I do it here. Presenting, okay, so it must be here. Can I share it? Yes, okay. So I will be talking about Grada Quilomba, which is a very plural artist. She's Portuguese, and she's now living in Germany. I'm sorry.
Should work. You press the present now.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing it?
We're not seeing anything yet, but now it's coming. Now it's coming.
Yes? Okay. So this is the title of my presentation, Grada Quilomba's essayistic and artistic transnational work and its consecration. So I would like to begin with a short presentation of Grada Quilomba for those who don't know her work. She's a Berlin-based Portuguese interdisciplinary artist and writer, and one of the first book she wrote, and it's kind of the first step to her creative work, is a book that is actually her master thesis. It's called Plantation Memories, Episodes of Everyday Racism. She published it in 2008. She published it in English, but in a German publisher in Berlin. That book is already in the 6th edition. And the book has a perspective about the root of Black people throughout history, and racism, and identity issues. So she has approached that theme all through her career, and also through her performative work. So her first exhibition, it was in Bienal de São Paulo in 2016. It was her first real international presentation of her work, of her performative work. It was called the Desire Project, and also she pre-presented her following work that was called Illusions, and furthermore became Illusions Volume 1, 2, and 3 the following years. And that particular performance, it was like a video installation, and with a narrative, like storytelling, with the Grada talking live over a muted video. And Illusions is about mythological, it's about Greek myths, reinterpreted Greek myths, with the perspective of the history of Black people and the colonialism that are recurrent themes of Grada Quilomba. This is an image of the World of Illusions. It's from an exhibition in Berlin. There are the actors, from the silent video, and then in left it's here Grada talking through the video, telling the story. She inspires this performative act in the African Creole when they were telling stories from the ancient traditions. So she recovers that persona. I would like also to present some chronological artistic route of Grada Quilomba, so we can see from the beginning of her career the places she has been presenting her work. So I put in the first place Plantation Memories, Episodes of Everyday Racism, because it's like the mother work from the presentation she does it after, and the Portuguese translation in 2019. I will talk about that furthermore. It took her 11 years to take her work to Portuguese, and that was kind of an issue. But after we have the different exhibitions she has made, she started in São Paulo, Bienal São Paulo in 2016 in Brazil, and then she goes to South Africa, she goes to Lisbon, to Germany, Canada, South Africa again, and UK, Brazil, USA, Switzerland, Canada, Netherlands, France, Portugal, Sweden. She has been kind of all around the world, especially in Europe, some African countries, and America too, South and North. But Brazil was very important in the starting of her career, because it was the first time she was actually acclaimed as an international artist. So this is kind of a map. She went from Portugal to Germany, where she lived in Portugal until her 20s, and then she went to Germany. She migrated to Germany to do her college degree and her master's and doctorate, her PhD. She studied in psychology, and she was at the same time teaching in university and developing her performative work along with her students and other artists. So it was the academic and the artistic work were always combined and were complementary to each other. So Grada's network, or the way she established her work in different countries, is a very unusual one, because she comes from the center. She began in Berlin. It's the center. It's the European center, and goes to Brazil and to African countries and to the US and Canada. But the reception is different in each one of them, and she appeals to different sensibilities, and as a performative artist gets different reactions. Grada Quilomba has roots in Africa. Her family is both from São Tomé and from Angola, and she is born in Portugal. She migrates to Germany, where she publishes her first book in English. Then she is acclaimed in Brazil in 2016, and then to the rest of the world. And then back to Portugal, because she in Portugal only began to be more well-known after the translation of her book, Plantation Memories, in 2019. Actually, there are many centers and many peripheries here that we can identify. Culturally, Brazil, and specifically São Paulo, is a very important center for performative artists. Bienal São Paulo is a very important event for artists to publish and to get their work well known. And in the Bienal São Paulo invited Grada, and then they kind of legitimate her work to be seen in other places, including Portugal. However, when she was in Brazil, she couldn't talk in her work language because Grada Quilomba, she's Portuguese, she was living in Germany, but she elected English as her work language. And she said she only could do it in English. She wouldn't do it in Portuguese or in German. In Portuguese, she says it has a very cultural weight. Like not only for the colonial history, for its historical weight, but also a personal one because of her personal experience as a racism victim. She talks about it very, very much in her book, Plantation Memories. So it's a very hard language for her. It has memories and it has, according to her, a lot of colonial marks, a very intense colonial marks. There's also a thing that she doesn't like in Portuguese language is that we don't have the neutral gender. We only have feminine and masculine, and she says that that is a very oppressive mark of Portuguese language, and she doesn't like it. But however, when she was in Brazil, she couldn't talk in her work language in English because, or else she will not be understood by many, as she felt and she talked about it in many interviews. And that was kind of a dilemma for her because Portuguese has that colonial weight, and English is, as Grada defends, is a more plastic language and is getting less and less identified with a single cultural identity because English is becoming, in the last decades, a true world language, not comparable to any other. It became like a think and work language to people all around the world. As here today, we are from different countries, Portugal, Italy, Sweden, Brazil, and we are all talking in English. So we are the practical, yes, we are the practical experience of what I'm saying. I'm sorry, I got a little lost. Yes, and for Grada, English is the language you learn and read about all the themes she talked about in her work, like Bell Hooks or Paul Gilroy or Frantz Fanon. She read all those writers in English and she feels comfortable talking about it in English. So this thing she experienced in Brazil, like she had to talk in Portuguese, was kind of a difficult situation for her, but because Brazil is a center, it's an artistic center, but it is also some kind of periphery in this perspective. And she has to adapt, as she has to adapt in other countries where she presented her work. But this matter of the language is rather sensible for her. So how am I in time? I'm sorry. I think. Can you tell me how much time do I have? Okay. So I'm right at the end. So I would like to just briefly talk about this relation between Grada and Portugal. She was here in 2019 to present her book, Plantation Memories, Memórias da Plantação, and it was talked about the translation of the book. It was something very difficult for her to she wouldn't do it herself. She could do it. She talks Portuguese. She is Portuguese, but she didn't want to do it. So a translator did it. But she has talked about it in interviews. It was a very difficult work because of that weight, that historical weight that it is present in the Portuguese language. And the translator had to adapt and it was a very difficult translation, like some words that Grada wouldn't accept because they had such a masculine or colonial or historical weight that she couldn't accept to be in her book. So this translation is a very important question for her. The link between this short presentation about Grada Quilomba's work and our project, AfroLab, and the institutions, that this project, Marco Bucaioni could talk a little bit about the project too, but it's divided in 3 parts about the institutions that consecrate the literatures from Portuguese-speaking African countries, the history, the institutions, and there's a 3rd part about the African descent and the literature written from African descent that are living in Europe. There is also the term Afropean that is being used recently, the term Afropean to those African descents that are living in Europe. And Grada Quilomba kind of gets into that profile that we are interested in, and they are trying to claim to live in the present as Grada does, and to own the present, bearing the memory and the historical past, but not be just restrained by it. Writing a new history from a different point of view, from the center, as Europe can be or not the center, and getting a new perspective about African Portuguese-speaking literature or art, because Grada Quilomba is actually mainly a performative artist. And I'm sorry, I'll finish here. Thank you. I'm sorry because I know it was a little bit confusing, but as I said in the beginning, these are just some first thoughts. We are beginning with the project, so please bear with my insecurity. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Muito obrigado. Now I feel self-conscious.
Yeah.
Can people hear me? As another Lusophone speaking in English, let's just ignore the question of language and go on. We'll come back. Marco Bucaioni from the University of Lisbon is presenting a paper called A Transnational Canon of African Literatures in Portuguese, ? North-South Inequality in Literary Institutions and Circulation. And I would make just one plea. I have this maybe bad, hyper-attentive habit of always using the chat, and I bring it to conferences and Zoom. So please start giving us some questions, in the chat, so that way our wonderful presenters are not left with a blank slate and the awkward pause after Marcello's presentation. Marco, please.
Sorry, thank you. Can you hear me? Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yep.
About my person, it's quite easy because Rosa has announced everything about our project, more or less, what's essential for that. So I'm not going to repeat that. I am also here I am physically in the University of Lisbon, so, which shows the link that I have to this institution physically. And sorry for the mask. I have to wear the mask when I'm not talking. I got my PhD in Italy at the University of Perugia in 2013. I'm Italian, and my graduation was also at the same university in 2006. Then I taught in some universities in Italy, and then I fled to Lisbon in order to join this group and this kind of work in this line of research. I'm also a literary translator from Portuguese to Italian, of course, and I translated some Portuguese, Brazilian, and African authors into Italian. So this leads to my interest in literary circulation on a transnational sphere, of course. Well, first of all, I began during my postdoc years, which lasted until some months ago, this research on the translations of these African literatures written in Portuguese abroad. And I collected some data, which are published in an article in Revista Mulemba in Brazil. It's open source. If anyone is interested, I will put the link in the chat here. So the numbers that I will give just a minimal amount of numbers and very quick, and interested people can go there then and check out. What I discovered today here, I have more questions than answers. Actually, I discovered that translations from Lusophone African to the rest of the world are not many. I found data about less than 400 translations, 386 to be precise, of which 301 have been made to the first 5 European languages in terms of quantity. That's English, French, Spanish, German, and Italian, of course. And the remaining 18 translations have been done to the other 19 European languages. But I don't want to detain myself on these cold numbers without any commentary. I have the number of translations per language, of course, in which I found that Italian has the first place, and I'm so proud of it because I'm Italian. But I have to say that me myself translated many of them, so it's not fair. Well, now, to be more scientific, I discovered that of these translations, just 23 of them have been published in the Americas. So 23 of almost 400, and which is sadder, just 6 of them have been published on the African continent, in African soil. So this leads to a consideration about who has invented these literatures institutionally and as agents, and who is translating, who is wording this literature, who is responsible for this transnational possible canon of literature. And it seems that it's Europe in general that still dominates agents, institutions, and flows of literature in this case. The fact that Africa doesn't translate Africa is quite commonly heard among specialists. But it's to see these numbers and figures is impressive, because if you think that if you're in Angola, for example, and you want to read someone from Namibia or Zimbabwe that's there, works have actually to be written there or somewhere else, and they have to pass through the knots of the system, which are Lisbon in the case of Portuguese-speaking world, and London, possibly New York in the case of an English-speaking world, before then up there being translated into the other language, possibly, and eventually being imported in book form back to Africa, which highlights the structure of the system. Of course, we suspected that, but to see the numbers is something terrible. Well, in terms of most translated authors, they are Mia Couto with 81 publications, Agualusa with 77, Pepetela with 44, Luandino Vieira with 23, Germán Almeida with 19, Paulina Chiziano with 12, and Agostinho Neto with 11. The other authors have no one has more than 10 translations. So these 8 authors are the real representatives of these literatures worldwide, but actually Miyakoto and Agualusa alone have a third of total translations. And if we add to that Pepetela with 44 and Onjaki, we have almost more than half of the total translation. So the structure of this possible transnational canon is unfair, of course, is unequal in distribution between authors. We have to add that in these 8 names, the only female name is Paulina Sciziana with 12 translations, and she comes at the 7th place. And I have to add another thing that is quite sloppy to discuss here because we can't assess it scientifically, but among these 8 people, we have 2 blacks. I mean, authors which can be considered black by their face in the Portuguese-speaking world are Agostinho Neto and Paulina Sciziana, and they are the 7th and the 8th of this list. And then we have Germano Almeida and Onjaki, which are mixed race. And the first 2 are possibly white. I mean, Miyakoto is white. He has green eyes. And Agualusa has some African descent, some black descent, but is very fair-skinned. But this is something I don't know if it's actually relevant because it's difficult to say that. It comes, of course, it leads to a discussion on literary citizenship and skin color. We of course accept Miyakoto's Africanity and Agualusa's Africanity, so possibly it doesn't lead anywhere. Then I have to say that first of all, in the domestic consecration of this literature, and by domestic I mean inside the Lusosphere, the action of not only Portuguese, but actually Lisbon-based agencies is almighty. These literatures were produced, were invented, were consecrated in Lisbon, actually. Considering that, even if Brazil has a long history of African studies and studies on this literature that runs back to decades of important names of scholars, and even if Brazil in the last decades or more has begun a new interest in Black literature in general, both Brazilian Black and African Black and Portuguese, because of a new legislation that made compulsory this kind of subject matter, both at schools and at the university level, I have noticed that especially of these names, of these most translated authors, actually almost no literary work was published in Brazil before than in Portugal. In the case, for example, of Miyakoto, which is famous, things happen at the same time now. So when some new novel is published in Portugal and contemporarily in Brazil. It was not the case at the beginning of his career, of course, but in general, the opposite never happens. That the Brazilian publishing market and literary field never discovered an African author that was then exported to Portugal and possibly then back to Africa. So the dominance of Portugal and of the Lisbon scene is complete and still is complete. For what concerns the internationalization, so the translational canon, we discover that again European agencies are fundamental, and I want to highlight 2 agents. And for once, when by agent I mean literary agent, and not agent in terms of theoreticians, because just one literary agency based in Frankfurt, that's Martin Literarische Agentur, dominates the selling rights of the selling of translation rights of Portuguese-speaking authors in general, and represents 7 of these 8 most translated authors, excluding, of course, Agostinho Neto. So, this combined with the fact that more than half of these translations have been supported by Portuguese governmental agencies, which have a program which supports translations not only of Portuguese authors, but also of African authors who write in Portuguese. We have a landscape in which it's possible to affirm more strongly that actually this enterprise of inventing, building African literatures in Portuguese and then exporting them into Europe and into the world is actually a European venture. How much time do I have, Paulo? 3 minutes. Okay, so I cut a lot of things here, and I'd say that I want to continue. 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes is a word, is a whole word. I want to continue to study this phenomena. First of all, I think that there's a theoretical concept that can possibly be useful for us, and not just for us in African literature, working with Portuguese speaking literature. That's the concept of a Portuguese language literary space. We, of course, are accustomed to study our literatures on a national basis, and it makes sense, of course, for a lot of things. But what I'm seeing in this translation corpus is that the most translators who translate African material from Portuguese into Italian, English, Spanish, and so on, also translated Brazilian and or Portuguese authors. And I see that in the most cases, publishers that publish translations from Portuguese African writes in Portuguese, also publish Portuguese and or Brazilian authors. So the circuit through which this literature circulates, mostly, in most cases, is the circuit of the Portuguese language. Its fame and its circulation is based on a circuit whose focus is the Portuguese-speaking world, more often than not, and not African, the African continent or African literature. I found just 2 or 3 publications among these 400 after 2000, which are included in publishers which focus is Africa. And I have the impression, and this is an impression, I don't have hard data on this, that actually in some countries like mine, like Italy, this literature circulates among academic and para-academic readers or learned readers who are interested in literature in general, not particularly in Africa, while, for example, some other products such as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, or in Italy, Ijaba Shego, who's an Afro-descendant Italian writer, have completely another readership. But in order to assess that, I have to study more. We hope that we have more new people in our projects in order to help us on this. And I think that I can stop talking. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much. Hopefully people can hear me. I myself am stuck in Barcelona because I came here to research the publishing industry as the capital of the Spanish-speaking world. And it's interesting that the Balcells agency represents writers, not only in Catalan and Spanish, but in Portuguese as well. Anyways, I'm not going to sneak in my questions. I love to see that we actually have very good questions in the chat. Without further ado, I would like to go to Marcello Stella from USP. His paper is called Independent Publishing in Angola, Mozambique, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau in the 21st Century.
Thank you, Paulo. I hope everyone is listening to me. I am Marcello from the University of São Paulo. I'm doing a PhD thesis about the Portuguese literary space, as Marco said, looking closely to the social history of some literary institutions, mostly prizes like the Prize Camões, also trying to do a prosopography of some African Portuguese-speaking writers, and working with some writers more closely, like Onjaki and Kalafi Palanga. What I'm going to talk here today, it's a part of my thesis that I'm working on. So it's really a work in progress. So feel free to ask me anything. Any comment will help me a lot. I'm going to read for you because I find more safe. Currently I'm in Paris working with Giselle Sapiro, and my French, it's better than my English nowadays, so I prefer to read for you, even if it's not the best way to present, I believe. So I'm gonna start. I will put just my presentation on. I think I'm sharing. I hope.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Although globalization has been considered as a process to expand the free movement of goods and people in a global economic space, as noted by Pierre Bourdieu, both economic goods and symbolic goods have encountered different barriers and constraints to cross borders. Hence, there is a need to think about how institutions and agents have exchanged and crossed their productions between national, supranational, and transnational frameworks, trying to make an analysis that surpasses nationalism and methodological monolingualism. This communication tries to account for the emerging independent publishers in Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Based on interviews and documentary research on the editors Sandra Tamel, owner of the publishing house 3009 of Mozambique, Filinto Elísio and Márcia Souto, owners of Rosa de Porcelana from Cape Verde, Miguel de Barros, direct publisher of Corubal from Guinea-Bissau, and Luiz Vicente, owner of Nimba Edições from Guinea-Bissau and Portugal. I will try to show how such agents have navigated the universe extremely concentrated and dominated by large transnational publishing conglomerates, literary superagents, and giant marketplace such as Amazon. Such editorial projects pursue a fight against colonial legacies that insist on being present, and these new publishers are trying to build new post-colonial literary geographies and geopolitics. What I would try to show. So, this communication relying on 12 interviews, I also try to include the experience of Cacimbo, Angola publisher created by writer Onjak, and Cavalo do Mar, Mozambican publisher created by the writer Embate Pedro in the presentation. 10 of the interviews were made using video conference. One was answered by email by a senior publisher from a transnational publishing house based on Mozambique. And the talks took place between October 2020 through March 2021 during the COVID-19 pandemic. One thing we can say at first, it's the problem of the anonymity in these studies. Most of times keeping a name unidentified in those very restricted sectors are almost an impossible task. So publishing houses and the publishers are going to be mentioned in full account most of times, and I will try to preserve their strategies and identities when I make collective statements about edition in our countries, or when referring to the ways of living and different social attributions or attitudes towards their practice related to the profession and the publishing world. The time covered by this communication goes back to the beginning of the 21st century and stops at its second decade. I will analyze the publishing houses and its owners, mostly relying on the founder work of Sophie Noël about the independent edition in France. In her research, published in 2012, Noël examines the social and human sciences critique edition, also qualified mostly by its protagonists as subversive and engaged. Despite the fact that we are not looking to scientific and political publishing houses, and our populations cover more of a literary devoted endeavors, some characteristics stated by Noël remain pertinent. As Noël noticed, the emerging of a significant number of so-called independent publishing houses is related to a severe economic crisis that the book industry and market were facing during the 80s and the 90s. Moreover, the creation of plenty of little publishing structures played a role of counter-response to the generalization of severe economic restrictions in the world of publishing. Although in this apocalypse scenario, the expansion left room for the activities of some small structures that could exploit some niche markets left aside by the industry giants. That's the position where we will find the independent space of publishing. The space following Noah findings and the first impressions that I took from my qualitative data built recently show some striking similar features. The unstable position of the independent publisher in relation with the economy, politics, the university, and the literary. They try hard to keep a balance between these four public spheres, but it's always a very troubled issue, because to maintain a relative independency of such spaces imply that you must count with some of them, but not entirely. You can't rely on a single social dimension at the cost of losing political or economic autonomy, literary value, and also your critical political beliefs and values. So these publishers are always coping with the need to find solutions, funding, partnerships, projects which match with their desires and expectations, and also with their essential needs to survive. All this in very relatively unfavorable markets for literature. At the same time, this precarious position can be seen as a strong symbolic one, since it reminds the foundational values of the literary field, the belief on the transformative, emancipatory, and revolutionary power of words and literature, its intrinsic insurgent capacity of promoting a better society, citizens, education, and freedom. In brief, we can say that those publishers live in an editorial space with porous borders and impermanent dispute. Next, I will try to sketch a very brief timeline of the construction of the edition in those countries. Therefore, I propose 4 historical periods: the colonial years, post-colonial years of hope at the mid-70s and 80s, the mid-80s to the mid-90s, a very busy economic and political moment, and the renovation and re-independence that goes beginning in the 2000s and goes to the 2020s. Obviously, I do not intend to exhaust the topic, but I believe that the evolution scheme of the edition of African Portuguese language literatures is basically the same, with some important variations depending on the specifics of each country. But the general picture could be described like this. I just want to say that it's always important and fundamental to highlight the importance of pre-colonial oral traditions of those countries, which will play a decisive role in the years of the struggle for independence and the newborn national literary traditions, especially in poetry. So I do not intend to affirm that the literary history of those countries started with the arrival of the colonizer, but we identified the arrival of the first print machines during the colonial times. So this is a very long part, so I'll just highlight the most...
Yeah, Marcello, você tem mais 5 minutos, só para você saber. Vale.
During the colonial years, you can see the installation of the first press machines, but mostly run by colonial administration, Catholic missionaries, and colonial administrators. After the independence, we see a lot of state projects, the creation of national institutes of book and disc, and also national unions writers who be responsible for publishing books. And we can see in Angola especially a partnership with some publishing houses in Portugal, such as Edições 70, to print books in Portugal and flown the books to those countries. And then after the mid-80s through the mid-90s, we see an opening of these countries to a market economy. They were really pretty much based on socialist economy guidance. And in this movement, we see a lot of influence of some international and transnational institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank. And at this period, the edition on these countries, publishing houses are going to suffer a lot. And most of the publishing houses, the public ones created, will will not continue, but on the other side, a lot of private endeavors are going to begin. So the period I'm talking, 2000s, it's when we see a flourishing of some private publishing houses in those countries, and I'm going to show very briefly these ones I talked to you that are very small. I'm not going to talk individually of them because I don't have time, but I will show you the photos of the creators and some information on the slideshow while about the collective portrait of them. Most of these publishers I'm talking right now are from very humble and underprivileged backgrounds. Just 1 of 8 are sons of high-ranking officials. In most of the cases, we see sons of primary teachers, industrials, medical and local workers, proletarians in some. Half of the parents have just elementary school or are illiterate. Especially the mothers. Most of the fathers reached at least a level of education closer to graduation or concluded it. Some of the publishers are sons of liberation fighters, but not high officials of the movements. All the publishers hold at least a graduation degree, architecture, sociology, medicine, engineering, business, literature, and librarianship, showing a clear movement of social and educational ascension in relation to their parents. 7 out of 8 hold some postgraduate or specialization degree closer to literature or public policies. Most were born in the late 70s and beginning of the 80s. Just 2 were born in the 60s. Despite qualitative difference, we can state that most of the publishers are from very popular backgrounds and are the first generation of postgraduate members of their families. Very well educated and trained, they have access to valuable knowledge to help in the administration of their home countries, but in most cases they see this path blocked due to the elite of the dominant parties in power. Therefore, some of them, the publishing house is also a means of making a good public service for their country, publishing important technical and historical material to influence public decision makers or to help to develop literary, critical, and technical skills and tools for younger generation of its fellow citizens. There is also a strong sense of the need for a nationalization of publishing. I mean, there's a perception, more of a concern actually, that many African writers, especially those from Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé, as Marco said, are just published outside of their home countries, notably in Portugal and Brazil, and then to the rest of Europe and the United States. A lot of writers and editors feel deeply uncomfortable and having all of his books not available to their fellow citizens. So these independent publishing houses come to try to fill up that void too. I'm running out of time, so I won't have time to speak about all the preliminary conclusions that are outlined.
Marcello, in exchange, and I hear an echo. So we have to move to the questions, and maybe you could bring in your conclusions.
Yes.
Pretend it's an answer to a question. So without further ado, Rosa, if you could gather up the questions that are asked for you. Each presenter has about 3 or 4 minutes to answer all the questions they've received. We'll just follow the order, okay? Rosa, Marco, and Marcello. So you have your 3 or 4 minutes now to answer your questions. You can also restate them and read them out loud if you want to.
Okay, so I'll start answering the question of Jean-Marie Jackson about the Greek mythology. There's a lot to talk about this, so I'll just say that Grada has one work. It's called Illusions, volume 1, 2, and 3, and she tries to reinterpret the myths from Oedipus, Antigona. I'm not sure how to say in English, but I think you get it, and Narcissus. And she tries to reinterpret those myths along with the history of the Black history. So, for example, just to give one example, in the Narcissus myth, Narcissus is like the white man that only sees himself in the reflection and believes that it's the only reality, the only accepted reality that exists. And the black body is like Echo, that is that nymph that couldn't speak her own words, only it was because of a curse. She was only able to repeat the last words she heard. And she was always following Narcissus. She was in love with Narcissus and with his perfection. So like the black body is like a metaphor. The black body is trying to, it has always been trying to get to the perfection of the white, you know, and is absolutely wrong. But the myth, she takes that myth and tries to reinterpret how the black body has been neglected and mistreated along the history. Okay, because Narcissus only saw the world at his own image, and everything was at his own image. So it's metaphors like this that she tries to rewrite the myths. Okay, I think I hardly could answer some briefly, but some answer. Now, Stefan, how important is verbal language in Quilombo's performance? Does she try to escape language through silence? Well, silence is important, mainly in the performative acts of Quilombo, because she works a lot with imagery and the image impact. So the silence is definitely important. But she always communicates through English, as I said. So the Portuguese language is not usually referred. But she, how can I say it? She tests the language. I'm recalling an installation. It is called the dictionary, where people are confronted with definitions, and with very small lettering. So you have to be very close to the monitor to read it, and you actually can see a reflection in it, and that is it's on purpose. So you can see the word, and you also can see yourself, and you can see, do I understand the real meaning of this? So that game between the words and the silence and the image is always present in Quilombo's work, performative work mainly. And then Viba asked, linguistic Africanity is linguistic Africanity present in the works of Grada? Because she writes in Portuguese. She does not write in Portuguese, Viva. She tries not to. But the Africanity, she dialogues with the Africanity mainly in tradition and some heritage Africanity that she claims. Like, for example, the persona of the griot, the storyteller. She likes to bring that persona to her performative acts, and another, like, I don't know, not in words, not in language, not linguistic Africanity, but with imagery, with tradition, with heritage, I believe. I think I could answer. Thank you.
Marco.
Marco caiu.
He just left?
He's left the building.
Marcello.
Oh, he's back.
Wait, he's back.
Marco.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I just clicked the out button. Okay, I lost the chat, of course, because I had to. Can you hear me? I can't hear anyone. Okay. I've lost everything of the chat. So I remember the Stefan Helgesson's question, of course, how many translations there are of Ungulani Bakakosa, and the dismal answer is, as far to the best of my knowledge, 3. Because I had some time, I've gone also in this time to the translation database of the governmental agency DJLAB, and they list 2 of them, and I have both in my Excel. So I suppose that actually there's just 3 of them, which is a scandal for us who know the place that such an author has in the academic canon. But
Marco,
yes,
I've found the questions for you. So
thank you.
We have Viba. How do you think that the formation of canon help languages and literatures? Are such transnational canons able to fight back any indigenous hegemonic canons? So that's Viba's question. And from Jean Marie Jackson, we have the actual numbers are fascinating. As a scholar who works outside the Lusophone world, curious as to whether Portugal, or for that matter Brazil, have any state-funded translation programs, or whether it's beholden to the taste of even larger markets like the German and the English. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure I understand the terminology of Viva's question. It doesn't help, of course. It doesn't. This is the problem. This is the problem of this international system. What I have to say about that is also that, for what I know, Portuguese writing Africa is such a tremendously difficult space for international theory, because, for example, we take Angola, that's the biggest country of this Africa. More than half of the Angolan population just speaks Portuguese nowadays. So as far as data, the data I collected, so less than half of Angolan population can speak another language that is not Portuguese, and the canon, and any possible canon, even domestically produced of literature, has to be in Portuguese. I mean, it mustn't, but you know, the coloniality of the language is in a huge question when you have such a situation, or when you have a situation like in Cape Verde or Saint Med, which are small states, but in which you have a linguistic situation of confrontation between Portuguese as official and Creole languages, in which nevertheless, more or less, the whole population can speak Portuguese. So the terms of people and authors with Portuguese down there is very different than in other places such South Asia. But the last thing, there are many works on that. I have something about that on my article that I quoted before. But yes, Portugal and Brazil have a lot of money, not a lot of, on translation. Brazil, something like 10 years ago, put on the balance a huge amount of money, but then the program was not so well succeeded and managed. Portugal, on the other hand, has less money, but the service of that program is steady. And yes, they are very aware of their marginality on a state level. That's it. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. That's amazing, Marco. Marcello.
I will answer Jean-Marie and Stefan, I think, at the same time. Talking about 2 examples that I couldn't say more. For example, Sandra Tamel, the publishing house she runs at Mozambique, she tries to publishing audiobooks in national language other than Portuguese, because the number of speaking Portuguese people in Mozambique is lower than other countries, and most of them that say that knows Portuguese sometimes are not able to read and understand complex books and etc. So she made audiobooks from the language Makua, Sena, and Xangana, and she also tries to build a catalog with non-binary authors, also a more diverse catalog with more diverse authors differently from the other ones that are most commonly published in Mozambique and Mozambicans outside Mozambique. But it's a very, very teeny structure. She's alone, like she's working alone and trying very hard to make up independent edition. And
Marcello, pensava que a sua qualificação de doutoramento era a tese mesmo, mas não é.
É a qualificação.
Não conheço o sistema, mas...
É a metade. Acho que na Inglaterra é confirmation.
Ah, sim. Tá bom.
Confirmation.
How are you doing in Sweden, Stefan? Are you guys opening up at all yet?
Well, it's not quite yet, but we're almost there. I mean, vaccinations are accelerating now, and I'll be getting my jab now in May. So,
Yay!
Yep. So that's a great occasion. Yeah. Pretty high infection rates.
Yeah.
Can I drink coffee, or is anybody fasting for Ramadan? I just want to know. Or do I have to switch my camera off? Is anybody fasting for Ramadan?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I think we're back, everyone. Are you there, Viva?
I don't think so.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh.
Okay, good. So, Jean-Marie, I think we can begin, probably.
Yeah, so this is the easiest chairing I've ever done. Basically, just a timekeeper for great presentations. My name is Jean-Marie Jackson. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University in the States. It's a real pleasure to be involved with you all because I have wanted to learn Portuguese for years and years and years. Can't find the time to do it, so this is my chance to live vicariously through research happening on Lusophone traditions, among other things. Okay, so without further ado, our first presenter is Viva, and you all are introducing yourselves, so I will just send a 5-minute warning over the chat in line with what Paulo was doing.
Thank you, Jean. So while I am presenting my PowerPoint on the screen, I speak a few things about myself. I hope I'm audible. I'm Vibha. I teach in the Department of English at Aligarh Muslim University. It is a university near a city near Delhi, so like it's near the capital. And I dabble with a lot of things. Specialization is a privilege, which I don't think countries like ours can have. But translation happens to be one of those dabbles that I engage with. And so today I'm going to talk about something very jazzy that has come up on your screen. And this is a part of a project that we are engaged with at our department. And this thought has come up only recently while engaging with a lot of things in translation. So when you get very close inside the process, you actually tend to realize that there are so many things which actually are needed to be rethought at a very rudimentary level. So my topic is violence of translation, assessing hegemonies, and there's a question mark just in case if somebody believes, are there any hegemonies of a global and aka neo-colonial world? So I'll be giving some very basic kind of definitions in the beginning, and then we'll go on to discuss about the problematics of my paper, of my presentation. So translation has generally existed as a benign vehicle of knowledge transmission and a bridge building activity, and with good reasons. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. A literary translation, however, irrespective of the original design or intention, has been a vehicle of cultural displacement and alienation in innumerable instances. The excesses of translation have been more or less studied only in the jargon of loss and gain in translation. So whenever we talk about translation, we go into this foray of, what has been lost at the level of language and what has been gained. So this is basically a very handy binary. In contemporary translation studies, with new concerns emerging as the guiding principles, the debates on loss and gain have diluted in recent years, and generally, there is an intention, or there's a kind of feeling that as if it is something outdated and we need not handle with this kind of jargon anymore. Are these new forms born of some exclusive paradigm in a watertight space and held no connect with the loss-gain binary that manifestly occupied translation studies in the bygone decades? So, these questions have come out of some watertight space, the questions that we are dealing at present. Do they not have any connections with loss and gain? And I feel a sense of impatience appears to have crept in the translation community towards discussions on loss and gain too soon before it could even effectively consolidate the non-Western translation discourses into effective theorizations. Most of the theorizations in translation studies focus on how to translate. Less has been said and even lesser has been theorized about how and what not to translate. So this problems with overall attitude that I'm taking up here. Less has been said, as I indicated already. Translation enjoys an image of a harmonizing, non-violent creative process that breeds within the mind of a translator through an interpose between his or SLTL linguistic competences. And there is a conspicuous non-negotiability towards this status of translation because whatever has been said in this regard is too little in magnitude to question the image. In dominant theorizations, translation has not only emerged as a process in isolation from the push and pulls of the meta-textual discourses, but the impacts of translation have also been insufficiently assessed, reviewed, and gauged. Despite the fact that a huge market power has pumped money into translation as a publication business, the impact of translation has been understudied and poorly documented. Has not this assumed non-negotiability of translation's creativity facilitated translation to grow into a violent weapon to perpetuate hegemony in an invisible way? So there's this very famous quote of Lawrence Venuti. Venuti has a very celebrated position about this violence, and of course, I'm not going into that direction. But there have been debates and discussion of this kind already, established. But what I'm trying to say here is a different direction. Irrespective of the shift from the linguistic in 1970s to cultural in 1990s, the translation studies have moved on with the normalizing of violence. Now, there's this paragraph that I'm reading right now here is a kind of, thing that we'll leave here and then we'll move on to discuss which will join the dots. Most of the colonized peoples of the last 2 centuries have been delivered into the knowledge of the world and have habituated with a sense of gratitude towards this deliverance without sufficient documented awareness that violence of translation is one of the most impactful and unacknowledged silent killers in their colonial journeys of this deliverance. Now, translation, history, and Englishness. So there's a kind of a deja vu feeling that as a person coming from this part of the world, and I look at translation as something emerging as English. Translation has been underestimated as a sidekick in the process of civilization and culturalization, and therefore it has been undermined as only a side villain. Because it was a sidekick, so now it is only a side villain. Translation is bigger as a pervasive process as compared to documenting the history of world orders by the hegemonic forces. History is a temporal translation of all that exists into an arrangement of presentness. So history is also a sort of translation, but what has happened is that translation has been seen as one part of history, whereas this should have been the other way around because history was actually a translation in the time and space metaphors. it is a perpetual, and writing history, documenting history, it's a perpetual process, especially by those who can afford to do that, and therefore it's a violence of a perpetual nature. This unquestionable status of translation has engendered the currency of Englishness to translation. So there was a time when we used to grow up in countries like mine, and this has already come up in the discussion today also, that we were told that you need to learn English in order to develop, you need to do this, you need to do that with English. So English was is still today, as promoted as one of the ladders to all kinds of successes. Translation has reached that stage. It has acquired that Englishness, that aura. And this will be an understatement when one can say that every ideological, cultural attempt to compare, contrast, inform, convince, and impact is a pulsation of translation's globalized grip in today's world. So what we mean to say here is that we need to look at translation, history, and Englishness in connection with each other. What has been, which has been the more important paradigm and which has been a subjugated paradigm. And translation is not something which is just a byproduct of the bigger issues. Actually, translation is a kind of a benign existence which nobody has ever questioned and has already, given oneself to it as a readily accommodating, defining quality which will deliver us into some kind of better world or better age or better identity. Now, if we look at and connect the dots with the present, as it indicates in my topic, I have to say this. Sorry, globalization and neocolonialism. I don't want to go into that discussion, like how they are equal or how can they be different, and there are some things which are not on the common ground, etc., and how jargon is different, or etc., etc. Those things are, those debates, they definitely engage a lot of interventions, but actually give up and support each other at the end of the day. What is more important is that these are writing on translation. And what kind of translation do I mean here? How globalization has led to neocolonialism, sorry for this spelling mistake, is as clear a phenomenon as is the fact that colonialism rode on industrialization. So colonialism was riding on industrialization, and it expanded, it celebrated itself, no matter what, however wrong it was or however wrong it was realized at certain point in history, despite that, it was once this speed was gained, this could never be stopped. We could not harness it back to its original. Communities, identities, genders, regions, cultures, countries, peoples, languages, ideas, dreams, and futures have been lost in this violence of translation, divided the world into this analogy. Now, this is the analogy, as I'll be winding up very soon. The analogy that is given here is that which happened in the industrialized world is unindustrialized world, the raw material, and industrialized world. This binary, a very celebrated binary, actually is the source and target. Source and target are two very basic words on which stands the whole paradigm of translation. This neat binary of ST and TT has led to disconnects, gaps, absences, fragmentations, pastlessness, uncertainties, and discomfitures as gained in this violence of translation. So what have we gained actually is this result, that ultimately globalization has equated it to source language and target language. Now, my last point is this. Neocolonialism is a repackaged continuum of translations violence. The violence that existed in the industrial period is a repackaged deliverance in neocolonialism. It makes the peoples being constantly translated as markets, consumers, and citizens of MNCs. Peoples are data, and data is an algorithmic translation of aspirations, dreams, utterances, relationships, and all kinds of possible novelties of human world. Like documentation of history, in colonial and post-colonial world, which is temporal translation of the data in the new colonial world. So in the new colonial world, the documentation of history has been replaced by the temporal translation of people into data. Has humanity ever thought of not translating? Has it really helped the world in becoming one global family which is infected with the same virus? But all are not equally vulnerable in that family. Did we ever hear of a world where existed some places that no one had ever ventured? Can this be ever rebooted to that situation? Only language, algorithm, currency left to us to search answer in translation. We cannot undo this process that is happening. There is never going back. Nothing else to say. We are all projects in translation. Someone, in fact, doesn't matter who has said this. Thank you very much. I'm sorry my slides went haywire because this is my first formal presentation after my COVID recovery. So sorry for that.
No apologies necessary. It's an apology-free space, and I'm glad to hear that you are on the mend. Thank you for that. So our next presenter is Joanna.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to switch on the mic. Glad to meet you all. My name is Oana Fotache Dubalaru. I'm teaching literary theory at the University of Bucharest. My latest publication is an edited volume on the work of perhaps the most translated Romanian writer in history, Mircea Cărtărescu, that just came out a couple of months ago, but is still isn't distributed yet on a large scale due to the pandemic. Hopefully it will be in the near future. And a while ago, I was involved in some projects, both in Romania and abroad, concerning translation of Romanian writers. Another project which involved academics from Italy, Portugal, Spain, Germany, was centered on the tension between national canons and the so-called European canon, and the image in each of these countries people have at high school level and at university level of the European canon. So my paper today tackles with literary journal published in Romania. Perhaps it would be useful to show you a few slides just to get familiar with the names and the websites. So I just show 5 or 6 slides. Okay, can you see them?
Yes.
Yeah. I've changed the title of my presentation a bit, so apparently it takes a different stance than VIBA before, but this is not exactly my belief that everything is translatable. It would be difficult to assert that in the current context, given the recent work done in the field by scholars such as Gayatri Spivak or Barbara Cassin or Emily Apter. But it certainly is the belief that the staff at Poesis International shares. So I'll be talking about this poetry journal that appeared. It was a quarterly journal in the beginning and then a half-yearly one. It was founded in 2010, published in Romania, and its promoter and editor-in-chief is a well-known Romanian poet, still a young poet, 38 years old, Claudiu Comartin. And you have here a cover of one of the issues and a list of websites, blogs, a publishing house website, literary festival one, the writer's blog, that are all of them institutions associated in one way or the other with the journal. The structure of my presentation, if I can pass through all these stages and ideas, will explain at first a bit of context in order to understand the novelty of the journal, then followed by a brief presentation of the journal in terms of mission statement, funding, distribution channels, things like that. Then I'll say a few words about contributors, staff profile, trajectories in the literary field, both in Romania and abroad. Then I'll talk about some distinctive features of the journal and a bit about its reception. Here you can see a photo of the editor-in-chief, who was born in 1983, contrasted with the photo of a well-known, respected Romanian poet and translator, active in the 60s up to 2011 when he died. He translated largely from English and from German. He translated Joyce, Kafka, Musil into Romanian, as well as a lot of English language poetry, American contemporary poetry, and was a very important figure for the staff of the journal. And the last slide presents some landmarks, a short bio of the editor-in-chief literary profile. I'll come back to it later on. So now I think I'll close the presentation in order to focus on the paper. In what sense everything is translatable for this journal? The emergence of such a journal, not to mention its relatively long lifespan of 11 years so far, is in itself an improbable event in the Romanian literary field, kind of a black swan, to borrow Nassim Taleb's phrase, with major effects on the fate of an important genre that is poetry in a minor and marginal literature. I'm talking about Romanian literature, of course, that is still less known in Europe and the world and less translated even in these times of free circulation of people and ideas. I've decided to talk about this journal because it's the most relevant example in the Romanian field of an institution with a strong transnational concern in terms of both content and audience. Also because it is an independent publication with an original profile that had to resort to creative means in order to ensure the quality of the contributions, to cover a large field, both geographically and historically, and to stay in print for so long when compared to other Romanian journals, of course. I have to delve into some context now. The first issue of the journal comes out in 2010, and it somehow inherits a significant and very impressive tradition, because during the communist period, there were a few literary journals that aimed at a broader public and published articles in international languages. They were the 20th century, one of them which circulated a lot in Europe, also Cahiers Roumain d'études littéraires. Yet their profile was more academic than literary. They were exposed to censorship, and quite often publication was delayed due to political issues. Also before 1999, there was a very active market for poetry in Romania. There were several top Romanian publishing houses, which were, of course, state-sponsored, featured series of international poetry alongside contemporary and classic Romanian poets. For instance, Poesis in the 60s, then Orpheus in the 70s and 80s, then the most beautiful poems in the 60s up to the 80s. The attempts to revive these institutions after 1989 eventually failed or didn't manage to enjoy the prestige of their models. So another important aspect regards the poetry anthologies that were published before 1989. The main function of which was informative, was educational, because this way the young Romanian poets had the chance to read modern and contemporary poetry. And the significant effect of the publishing of these anthologies was the so-called English language turn of the 1980s generation of poets, who no longer looked for inspiration at French, Italian, Spanish, or Portuguese poetry as their predecessors in the 60s or before. And one of the most active translators, as I've said, was Mircea Ivănescu, who would become the mentor of the poets of this generation, editors of Poesis International. This new poetry journal came out in a field dominated by traditional style literary magazines, which lost a large part of their audience in competition with literary blogs or other online publications. And the place of translations and articles about international literature was marginal in these journals after 1990s, let's say, more often than not relegated to their final pages if present at all. So paradoxically, the editorial market capitalized on translations and still is doing that, translations especially of fiction, or non-fiction, not poetry, which these translations thrive in terms of sales when compared to contemporary Romanian literature. But the reception, again, paradoxically, of these translations is disappointing in the literary milieu, since very few critics actually write about them in the cultural press. So as regards literary studies in the academia, one notices that literary criticism and historiography largely kept their national and provincial focus. Only recently, during the past 10 to 15 years, PRE and comparative literature enjoyed a revival in the academic and editorial space. So no wonder that contemporary Romanian literature had little circulation, both in translation and also in the educational system, as high school and even university students possess little knowledge of what has happened lately meaning the past 3 decades, at the international level. So the educational system is still focused on classic or modern writers at most. So the scope and the quality of such an editorial project are even more valuable when considered on this background of a narrow, provincial, and largely conservative literary culture. There are some similar projects, of course, but not as effective as Oasis International. But I think I'll skip this part. So let me talk a bit about the journal, its history, its structure, and mission statement. Oasis International has 2 series. The first 12 issues, when it was labeled as a literary magazine, then the next 14 issues so far, with a 1-year interruption in 2012. There were some changes in structure, in format between these 2 series, but not in its main objectives. The second one had a smaller and a more coherent editorial team, which involved a younger generation of editors and writers. So the corpus I looked into includes 26 issues that spanned 11 years, plus a lot of interviews with the editor-in-chief and some other reviews, comments, notes in the cultural media. From the very beginning, the staff was aware that it was very difficult to publish a poetry journal targeting an international audience with original and translated text. So therefore, they opted for this quarterly rhythm. Then this rhythm was reduced to a half-yearly one, and now they are struggling to publish even these 2 issues a year, which are very rich. There are more than 200 pages for each issue, and with a very beautiful presentation. Okay, I'll rush on. So they include several columns, mainly poetry that translated from and into Romanian, also fiction, essays, etc. Portraits, presentations of newly funded publishing houses specialized in poetry in order to raise awareness among readers about them. It was financed through private support at first, and its print run is about 400 copies, so it cannot exist this way. Once a new issue is published, the full text of the previous one is available online, and it can be read online because it's actually in many different languages, not only Romanian. This was a good strategy for distribution and for the journal's symbolic capital, obviously ridiculous in terms of the economic capital. It was published not in one of the traditional cultural centers, but in the northern part of Romania, then moved to another provincial small town, and it's still published there officially. Some issues were funded by Romanian cultural agencies or programs, others by foreign cultural institutes, or by crowdfunding. Its price is very low, from 2 to 6 euros, varied in time, and this actually matches the usual fee for literary translations paid by Romanian publishing houses, which is about 3 euros per page at the maximum level. So I'll try to talk a bit now in the last minute about its mission statement. Its main interest would be in what I would call ultra-contemporary poetry on one hand, but on the other hand in revisiting poetry from other periods, both Romanian and foreign, from the Middle Ages on, from, let's say, Arnaud Daniel or a 15th century Spanish poet Jorge Marinque, to Nerval or to Pound or to contemporary poets from all over the world. The most consistent part focuses on contemporary poetry. Also, classics are presented in new translations and alternative forms such as hip-hop poetry. So this journal was established as a place of intercultural dialogue. It was very attentive to the new features of the literary field, considering the diminished circulations of books and the spectacular increase of literary presence on the web and so on. So the constant objective would be to promote translation and circulation among poets from all over the world. Not just to advertise, to export Romanian poetry abroad, but to facilitate translation workshops, to bring together poets from two separate languages, traditions, or even three, and to try to give a sense of what is happening, not only at the level of the canonical peaks, so to speak, but to cover very large areas, very different generations, and this is reflected in the journal and in its broad span. They promote a vision of poetry as an art of generosity, as a form of intercultural exchange. I would say that it's the main points, distinctive features of their politics are diversity, stability, and quantity, and of course the impact that they had on the market, both Romanian and foreign. This diversity is incredible on several levels. Firstly, there is a diversity of languages. Beside the European languages, one can find poets and poems in Arabic, in Turkish, Japanese, Indonesian, and from many more countries. For instance, Zambia or Syria would be some of the unexpected ones for a Romanian market. Sometimes these poems are published only in the original, but most often in translation in one or two languages. There is also an attention to minor literatures, to Romanian poets from Hungary or the US, but writing in English, or in Romanian in Hungary, to Scottish poets, Native American poets, and so on. They publish migrant writers, such as a German poet living in Romania. In terms of stability, there is this permanent editorial staff, which suffered very few changes over the years, 2 or 3 people that came in or out, and they had a very clever strategy of legitimization because they relied on a network support. And the result of all these efforts was to try to build up an alternative literary field, not exactly an avant-garde one, because it looks back at older generations and poetic styles, but to build up institutional partnerships with associating the journal to editorial projects of experimental publishing houses, to literature festivals, to foreign cultural institutes with branches in Romania, to reading clubs, etc. They had, of course, some international foreign models like Poetry Europe, poetryinternational.org, and some others. What is most impressive is the quantity they rely on. For instance, in each number, you would find a section that presents 3 or 4 or 5 poets from the same literary culture, not just one, translated into Romanian or Romanians into other languages. And generally, the smallest number of languages you would have in an issue would be 9 or 10, later on to increase up to 18 or 12 or 20, 25 in the latest issues. I think I have just 1 minute or 2. Jean-Marie? Or just one? Okay, to conclude, I would say that the impact of such a journal, though not spectacular apparently on the Romanian literary field, is very important on a larger span of years, because there were many important prizes awarded to young poets published by the journal or by the affiliated institutions, not to mention the fact itself that these poets were published at all. This effect of building up a lively transnational literary history, also an alternative history of Romanian post-war poetry, because they tried to revisit poets that were largely ignored by the critical establishment. And I think it's also an interesting case to consider from the perspective of the comparative literature discourse or world literature discourse, because one is reminded at first view of Hugo Melzel's project in Acta Comparationis Literarum Universarum, although this one is more structured and has the potential to grow even further. And it's more consistent in its politics to promote actually a true and authentic language and cultural exchange between all these poets that actually many of them have met during the years. So I think I'll stop at this point and skip the ending, okay, and leave it till next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joanna. And we are moving on to our last, but most certainly not least, presenter, Ashley Harris.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, are you seeing my the correct screen? Does it look good? Excellent.
Well, we're seeing it says presentation Ashley Harris, and that's all.
Aye. Okay, how strange. I will try that again. Presentera ett fönster, va, Stefan?
Presentera nu. You can also choose to just present your whole screen, and then you can do it that way.
Yeah, but it actually was the darn.
This is looking better, I think.
Okay. Let me see now.
Yet. Yeah, there we go.
Yay. Okay. I did exactly the same thing. It just worked the second time. Okay. I'm Ashley Harris. I work at Uppsala University in Sweden, although I'm originally Southern African. I took seriously Stefan's prompt for us to bring new work, as Rosa said as well earlier. So basically, I'm going to be talking about some previous work only in order to set up this new idea that is really fresh and very new, and I would be very well. Any comments or ideas would be very, very welcome. So my current research has focused on the sustainability of the literary book in Africa, by which I mean primarily novels, but also collections of short stories or poetry. The book object carries a great deal of historical weight in this context, and its unsustainability is, I argue, due to three primary factors, some of which we've already heard about today. First, structural adjustment programs in Africa in the 1980s severely compromised the publishing and book industry there. Second, strong traditions of alternative literary cultures, such as oral forms and pamphlet literatures, have flourished, both historically and in the present, in the highly complex informal sectors of African urban society, and these have flourished as alternatives to the formal publishing industry. Such alternatives have been attractive in part precisely because of the colonial residues in publishing, which remains dominated by European languages and Western aesthetic gatekeeping. Third, the almost universal rollout of mobile technology across the continent and its coincidence with Web 2.0 technology in the 2000s have made books obsolete as data costs sink and book prices soar. The result has been an outpouring of non-book literature, some of which builds on existing pre-colonial literary and oral traditions, such as spoken word poetry, storytelling, and performed dramatic arts, and some of which explores new online forms and possibilities, such as Twitterature, flash fiction, GIF novels, Facebook fiction, and online comics. To illustrate the problem of the book in this context is in a little bit more depth, I'm going to focus on the publishing and book trade in South Africa, which is one of Africa's largest literary producers. I base what follows on a data set that I acquired through the Nielsen Book Scan, which provided me with full point of sale data on fiction and poetry from all formal booksellers in South Africa over a 5-year period, 2015 to 2020. But before I talk about the unsustainability of the literary book, I feel I need to take a concrete look at what the South African book trade looks like today. For this, I'm going to focus only on last year's data. So 2020 will be what I focus on throughout today's presentation. In 2020, 1,008 individual South African titles and a total of 280,500 books were sold. South African books were sold in South Africa. The top-selling book was Donkedrif by Afrikaans crime novelist Dion Meyer, which sold almost 300,000 copies in that year. And it's important to note that this constitutes almost 10% of all fiction sales last year in South Africa. The book that follows this is actually a self-published novel by romance writer Dudu Busani Dube, Iqunga, which despite its isiZulu title is written in English, around 10,500 copies. There's quite a discrepancy there between the two books, but nevertheless, these numbers look quite healthy. While the industry is not exactly thriving, these numbers are indeed respectable, and compared to neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, where less than 5 novels are published on average a year, the numbers look pretty good for the region. It'd be interesting to compare to Mozambique too. So why am I still concerned about the sustainability of the book in South Africa, despite these numbers? If we take a closer look at those 1,008 different South African novels that were sold in South Africa in 2020, we find that 687 of them were written in Afrikaans, 319 in English, only 2 in isiZulu, and none in the remaining 8 national languages of the country. This is extraordinary for a country in which first language speakers of indigenous languages constitute 77% of the population, a population of 60 million people. English only accounts for around 10% of first language speakers, and Afrikaans 13%. But in the formal data, only 2 books in an indigenous language are captured. So you can see the linguistic distribution of South Africa is inverse to the languages that literature is formally published in. If we take an even closer look at the 2 isiZulu novels that were sold in South Africa in 2020, the picture becomes even sharper. Bengiti Lizokuna by Nankanjani Sibiya is a set text on the curriculum for the school leaving certificate in isiZulu. Yet only 229 copies got sold. That's not a lot of books for a set high school text in a country of this size. But a quick Google search reveals the reason. The book is widely available as an illegal copy online. I've written elsewhere about the illegal book trade in African cities and how this contributes to the unsustainability of the formal book industry. The second text is a collection of short stories by Fred Khumalo, which only sold 44 copies, despite the fact that Khumalo is one of South Africa's most well-known commentators in the press. He's also a very well-known writer in English. His English language texts sell relatively well, one of which sold over 2,000 copies last year. So the example, I think, is a useful diagnostic of the state of the isiZulu book, and by extension, all South African indigenous language books today. On the face of it, it may look as though there simply is little to no market for South African language literatures. However, my findings in 3 case studies of independent bookstores with a strong South African interest suggest something different. The bookstores, all based in Greater Johannesburg, were Gara Books, Bridge Books, and African Flavor Books. And I received their lists. This was in 2017. Going through their lists at that point, I found that around 5% of their stock were self-published fictional and or poetic content. So this amounted to around 100 to 150 individual books per bookstore. Yet, when I looked at my Nielsen BookScan data on self-published books, this one was for 2017, only 2 titles came up. So there's around, I don't know, I haven't been able to crunch the data from the bookstores properly yet, but there's around 100 or so books sitting on shelves, but the BookScan is not capturing the data of the sales of those books. These self-published fictional and poetry titles have a significantly higher representation across all national languages. For me, this suggests that the informal book trade is developing in ways the publishing industry is not, of course. But for my purposes today, I'm more interested in how these self-published books fall under the radar of capturable data. Indeed, in interviews With all 3 bookshop managers, I was told that some authors not only self-publish, but also distribute to themselves, and some prefer to receive cash for books sold. A quick aside, this is how the author Busani Dube, who's the second highest seller in South Africa last year, began her book self-publishing industry. So a lot of self-published work is falling under the radar. What about small publishers then? I received a list of independent and small publishers from Nielsen, from the Nielsen Bookscan, which included 19 different imprints. But if we have a look at the African Small Publishers Catalogue of 2018, which is of course not at all a complete list, but even that incomplete list provides us with many more small publishers that are active around this time than appear in the formal data. Small publishers also deal with a high degree of precarity. If we look through the catalogue over a 10-year period, one can trace the emergence and folding of numerous small publishing initiatives within a year or two. A useful example indeed is Fred Khumalo's book mentioned above, which was published by an isiZulu small publisher called Kwasukela, which only published a novel per year in 2018 and 19 and then closed down. And perhaps a note for Joanna, this is a fate similar to that of literary or small magazines in South Africa, which unfortunately I don't have time to go into now. Okay, but if we leave printed material and turn to online literary content, we observe an entirely new scale of literary production and consumption. As part of a research project, African Street Literatures and the Futures of Literary Form, run by myself and Nicholas Holian, we collected and archived hundreds of informal literary texts from Lagos, Ibadan, Nairobi, Harare, Johannesburg, and Cape Town. The majority of these texts were online, and to illustrate my next point, I will turn to a data set compiled by Jasmine Matty, a student research assistant on our project. Jasmine collected over 330 online sites, including individual literary works or collections of works for South Africa alone. These works range from spoken word video performances to online comic books, from blog fiction to WhatsApp fiction. There are also multimodal examples, as well as writing that begins online, mostly via social media, and then is self-published and sold as a printed book. The material is diverse in form, language, quality, and genre. This kind of digital literature has prompted numerous studies in the broader field of African literature and African studies recently. And here are some excellent examples. Initiatives like Kansas University's African Digital Humanities seminars and center are thriving at present. However, despite this flurry of scholarly attention, I argue that the ephemerality of this work means that it risks falling into oblivion once scholarly attention turns elsewhere. This is a pattern that we can, of course, trace through the history of literature that we can trace throughout the history of literary scholarship on South African literatures outside of the formal publishing industry. While a lot of work has been done on the early Black press and mid-20th century magazines, and while recent digitization efforts have ensured the longevity of those works in the archive, numerous key texts of South African literary history have, of course, been completely lost. If I had time to enumerate what we know of these lost literatures, I could be here for some time. But suffice it to quote Jeff Upland, who writes of South Africa's most significant Imbongi, which is a Xhosa poet of the late 19th to mid-20th century, S.E.K. Mqhayi. A vast quantity of Mqhayi's prodigious output now lies largely unappreciated in old newspapers, or else was committed to manuscripts now irretrievably lost, victims of the politics of publishing in Xhosa. While writing that fulfilled the genre conventions of the novel has tended to survive through archiving, transcription of oral cultures such as proverbs, songs, and stories, were far less likely to be published as books or even in newspapers. And when self-published, when these books were self-published, which was actually common at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century for Black South African writers, those texts were often in very small print runs and weren't considered relevant for archives, and as such have not largely survived. If that were only a historical problem, it would be one thing. However, it is exactly the same politics of publishing, I argue, in indigenous languages, and perhaps even in the form of the novel, that obscures. Sorry, I just lost myself. It is exactly the same politics of publishing in indigenous languages that obscures a book like the one we see here. This is a collection of poems by the Mbongi Timbeke Sesi, who has self-published this and other volumes of her transcribed oral poetry. You'll see she unapologetically calls this a tapestry of my conversations, unrehearsed, unedited. Sesi's books do not appear in the national data and probably have not made it into authorizing literary institutions such as the library or the university classroom either. Yet she's a significant figure in isiXhosa poetry at present. In a few years' time, I wonder what the likelihood of her remaining in the archive will be. If we are horrified by the scenes we saw recently after the African Studies collection at the University of Cape Town was ravaged by fire, it is all the more awful to think that this image symbolizes not only the South African literary archive of the past, but potentially that of the future too. On to my current work, and I know I've only got about a minute left, but it won't take me long. My current work is committed to trying to find alternatives to the continued dominance of the English and Afrikaans novel or book as the object around which we organize our understanding of South African literature. So long as we continue to privilege this form, we will actively be complicit in keeping other kinds of writing, poetry, performance in a perpetual state of ephemerality, as always only ever emergent. Let me clarify. When we think of the archive, and we tend to think of it as a physical space in which materials are housed and curated, we can miss something of even greater significance, being other than very rare objects, rather. It is perhaps the metadata of the archive that is its most significant asset. Much of the standard collection destroyed in the Cape Town fires can be reconstituted by the library on the basis of its metadata, of course. The structure of this metadata is entangled in other kinds of data, such as that created by publishers or that embedded in ISBN numbers. But what happens when you have to create metadata for objects that do not come from formal patterns, do not come with any formal patterns of metadata creation? So any of the sort of ephemeral works that we've, for example, collected in African street literature. The challenges presented by print ephemera in terms of meta tagging and nowadays digitization as a strategy for saving ephemera are indeed very well known. And these problems are made all the more complicated when it comes to digital ephemera. As librarian and cataloging expert Brynne Michael says, many are familiar with the arduous process of describing physical ephemera or other types of obscure and challenging information artifacts, but digital ephemera present an even more complex undertaking. Tweets and other types of social media posts exemplify the intricacy of such artifacts. Interactive by design and ephemeral by nature, it is practically impossible to capture a suitably descriptive context of a collection of tweets through the means available to archivists and librarians now. So my question is, if so much literary production is moving over to these forms and we don't actually have a metadata standard to even think about how to construct an archive of them, what will happen to the archive of the African literary future? let me close by telling you about, very briefly, the idea that I'm trying to work on at the moment, and that I'd love your feedback on. It's an experiment that will be called the Contemporary African Ephemeral Literatures Archive, an experiment between literary producers and commentators, librarians and archivists, activists and scholars, to develop a robust, ethical and usable standard for description of metadata of African ephemeral literatures, and to put that standard to use in an online and open access platform that acts as an archive of digital ephemera. It is essentially an archiving practice and tool that will not take the book as its organizing node and extrapolate a metadata logic from that material object. Instead, it will be open to multiple forms and modalities. It will involve crowdsourcing to include street-level description, tagging, and information. It will enable transcription of performed texts and will be open to crowdsourced translation to encourage translation across African languages. But because it's an experiment, I will need to find a way of getting funding for it. And that is going to be the next big challenge. Sorry, I should have had that slide up there. But if anyone's interested in being in touch about the project, please contact me. My details follow here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. I think we'll do what Paulo did with the last session, and hopefully we can just take each presenter in order. And if you could kind of bundle your questions and respond to them, that would be great. So we'll start with Viva.
Yes, thank you. So there are two questions. One is from Stefan and the other is from Paulo. When I'm talking about what not to translate or when not to translate, of course, it's a kind of subversive discourse that I'm looking forward to. And that definitely includes a lot of diversity. We cannot again homogenize this subversion. And therefore, this question of different instances and practices remains very crucial. Yes, there should be some kind of concessions for things that are not so harming, or we need to actually look at it in a very nuanced way. So that is my answer to this question. And translation across Indian languages that bypass English, for example, yes, that's a very important case in point. Because it's high time actually that we sit down as readers, as translators, as academics, and sometimes just to discuss why this cannot be translated, because the whole effort is all about creating a mapping of translatability rather than creating a substantial discourse of non-translatability as an equally important paradigm. So non-translatability is not just a reductionist kind of paradigm. I think it needs to be looked at as some kind of constructive ways into looking at identities and their values, lest we tend to homogenize things. And yes, the question by Paulo is that at Jaipur Literature Festival, this is a literature festival annually held in Jaipur. Translators complain most vernacular translation is now to and from English. A generation ago could be between vernacular languages. Is Hindi now dominating? So this is my concern, that what good, a particular Indian language getting translated into English is actually doing to other languages. How this can be a two-way traffic. There's no good in that. So we are actually being delivered into a currency or into a linguistic territory, which definitely is never going to include all the other languages as sisters or as the readers. So it remains an exclusivist paradigm that way also, and so it's a lost case. So whether, there are hundreds and hundreds of books being translated in India, in fact, millions of books translated in India into English, and they do not reach the readers. No English audience bothers to read them. So what is actually the purpose of translation? And is Hindi now dominating? To a certain extent, there is a lot of, market is definitely pumping a lot of translations into Hindi, but it is definitely no way close to what English is doing to the linguistic translations or translation scene or translation map of South Asia. Thank you.
Joanna?
Yes, thank you for the questions. To Marcello's question first, the Poesis International didn't establish a prize, but a literary festival, yes, they did. Actually, they came out pretty much at the same time. In 2009, there was the first edition of the festival. Poetry is in Bistrica. Bistrica is one of the two small towns that published the journal. It was a festival actually of poetry and chamber music, very popular in avant-garde circles, I would say. But they also had this literary club affiliated with the journal and the publishing houses, a publishing house that helped translate foreign writers, I don't know, Turkish, Serbian, Swedish, from all over the world into Romanian, like dozens of books, even 100 of books published during these 10 years. So yes, they had this decide to parallel initiatives to establishing a network of institutions to help the journal, to promote it. To Stefan's question, I said marginal when, of course, on the global market, on the global editorial market, and also as Romanian literature views itself traditionally, because there has been a lot of debate about the complexes of inferiority of the literature as a, I don't know, imitator of French or Romance literatures in the 19th century and then on into the first half of the 20th century. So this complex, it was inscribed in the DNA of previous literary generations, and it started to change during the past decades or so. The answer, yes, it's a very dense literary activity, but I would say that the most interesting aspects and the most innovative aspects are outside the mainstream, the popular section of the field, and are marginalized by the decision makers, by the agents that have the power to promote and to circulate, prizes, writers, and so on. And if I may have a question for Paulo, could you say when Mircea Cărtărescu asked you to help him be translated into English?
So 2 years ago, the Formentor Prize, one of the most prestigious literary prizes given in Spain, and it's given to, it could be any Romance language.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was presented with the prize, and I was invited to be in Mallorca as part of this literary event, but I was just a guest. And he found out I was from NYU, and I actually was able to put him back in touch with New Directions that had dropped him as a writer after one book because he didn't sell.
Yeah.
But it was just astonishing. He came up to me and he said, "I don't have an agent. My Spanish publisher handles foreign rights. Can you help me?" So
that's true. Yeah.
Not what I was expecting. How could I help him, right? And here in Spain, in Barcelona, his books go into 11th edition, 12th edition. They're translated into Catalan.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a major writer, a candidate for the Nobel Prize, and he exists in English with what, one or two?
Two books.
Translations.
Yeah, two novels, one, not the best translation he could get, but just the first volume of a trilogy translated then, and of course his poetry books are not translated. They are
off the record, the translation is the issue.
Yeah,
I think if there was a better translator, Barbara Epler at New Directions and other publishers would be more than happy to translate more Cărtărescu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an issue always. You're right. Thank you.
Yeah, don't wait.
Okay. Okay.
Wow, I like this power.
Thanks. Thank you so much for the questions. I don't want to take up too much of the discussion time, so I think I'm going to pick out one comment about a question from Rosa about Dudu Pusani Dube, because I think it's relevant in this context. She is self-published. She's created her own publishing house that only publishes her books. And in fact, that publishing house she's from 2017 onwards, has earned more on fiction than any other publishing house in South Africa. And she says that the reason why her books are so popular, she started it just on Facebook, and now she releases the first half of the book on Facebook and then publishes the rest, and people can't wait for the next installment, and so they buy it. But she says the reason why she's so popular is that she didn't publish with a publishing house because there's something more relaxed, about the way she writes. She says no one would ever have published her. They would have considered her a bad writer. So, and she says that allows her to speak to the people she wants to write for. And, so I think there's something there about, again, publishers as gatekeepers, as well as the kind of infrastructural stuff that we can think of together. But I think it would be great to just have a conversation. So I'm going to leave it there if that's okay. Thanks, though, for all the other questions. I'll email people.
Thanks, everyone. So I guess I get to turn over my power back to Stefan now, huh?
Okay.
My power to summon in silence Ashley Harris.
Thank you, Jean-Marie, and thanks everyone for an amazing, afternoon here in Sweden, evening, I suppose, in India, and morning in Brazil. This has been so inspiring. It has made my day. We have a few more minutes. I know that Paulo had some more questions, perhaps, so we could take one of those and then just wrap up.
I guess my question...
So one from Paulo, one from Jean-Marie.
I guess my question was directed towards Marco, but maybe so general that it really, I'd be interested if anybody feels like they would like to jump in. He referred to the sort of international literary space. And of course, when you're around Sapiro, and actually just when I'm in Paris, I feel like there is such a thing as an international literary field. It's not just the market, there's something else. When I read a Gallimard book, it's transforming its symbolic capital into actual capital, blah, blah, blah. I'm still wondering exactly, Marco, I don't know how that works internationally. I would love to believe, and I'm more convinced by the examples that we got about these smaller publishers or even Facebook publishers or other ways of publishing outside the book industry or the market. But I'm not sure I believe in a Bourdieu type literary field that exists in the ether outside of the market. Somehow hovering in Frankfurt as a kind of ghostly presence as the deals are being made. But anyways, so maybe Marco could take that or somebody else could jump in.
Yeah, for sure. Well,
could we take Jean-Marie's question also, and then...
Yes, sir.
Mine was more of a kind of summarizing comment that also feeds right into Paulo's, which was that the sort of weight behind a lot of these presentations, I mean, certainly Ashley's at the end was the perfect finale, is about whether or not it's possible to think of literature as a livelihood. And for so long now, we've been talking about the professionalization of the literary sphere, at least where I work, and the rise of MFA programs, the globalization of MFA programs. Certainly South Africa is a really interesting case study for that. And yet the actual data that we saw in numerous of these presentations, from Marco's and Ashley's especially, seems to bear out something that I've long suspected, which is that, God, it just really, it's not enough of a professional possibility to be meaningfully discussed in those terms. And yet we've got this massive apparatus around it. And so I think it'd be interesting to, Marco, if you could even bundle it into your response too, to think about, well, what other language do we have available to us for thinking about writing and a writing life that is not necessarily a professional one, which is not to say that it doesn't have an economic valence, but what is it?
Well, first of all, I founded a publishing house, a little imprint at a certain point in my life. So I know the importance of the raw economics of the venture. But theory is just theory, you know. Theory must help us to think things in the content of our studies. Me myself personally, I'm a little bit outdated maybe, but the intuition, Bourdieu's intuition and the developments about symbolic capital makes sense in a lot of subfields and places. For me, I feel that can make some sense. It's not just market. Yes, of course, the market and soft power by nations or empires in terms of languages is determining, and this strange creature of the Republic of Letters follows that lines, but doesn't explain everything. It doesn't, in my opinion. There's just, and so hence that concept is operatively interesting for me. But that hasn't been the Bible. It's just something useful. Theory must be useful to think. It helped me to understand why the problem that every Lusitanist has, that is why our beloved Portuguese-speaking literatures is not so famous as we would like to, because we know it and we know that it's valuable, but the other people don't listen to us. Why? And that little concept helped me a little bit in that road to feel better. Just that.
Yeah, I love that answer. And also, I'll remember the line, theory is just theory. I mean, that's very useful also when teaching. So theory is just theory, but real substantial research is real substantial research. And I feel we've heard a lot of that today. So again, this has been such an inspiring afternoon. And I'm very happy that there will be a second installation of this workshop in September. Just, meeting all of you, although on screen, I think this will need to lead to some kind of follow-up eventually, and perhaps, physically on site in an actual place. So, Marcello, would you like to say anything?
I would like to thank you all, and also just for this last one of Professor Paulo. I think some works by students from Giselle, like Tristan Lepellier, Claire Ducournau, Madeleine Bédécarré, that they studied Francophone or Arab literature. They dig very deep in, and they are developing different ways also to deal with the Bourdieusian tradition and seeing and applying or working with it in different contexts. And I think it's pretty much what Professor Marco said. We use it until it's useful for us, and I think it's a theory. And I'm really I appreciate a lot our workshop today, and I learned a lot with you. And I think we can see each other in September online, maybe in presence if things gets better. And I really like to thank you all.
Just very quickly, Marcello, I think Bourdieu is more useful than most theory. I just sometimes find, as the further I'm away from Paris, the more I wonder. Here in Barcelona, I still feel I'm close enough to feel the literary sphere. But anyways, Stefan, I have a horrible bureaucratic request of you. If you were able to stay online for a few minutes from the ICLA, an urgentish question for you.
Oh, sure. I can sound like.
But I would like to thank you for inviting me to chair a panel. It was such a pleasure, and I really learned so much today. And I just feel very ignorant towards the Lusophone African literary production, for example. Even though I read Mia Couto and the top two are free writers mentioned, but I just feel so much less ignorant after hearing these presentations. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Yeah, special thanks to Jean Marie and Paulo for giving so generously of time to join us.
And I run jockey regularly, so I've made it for like the top 3, you know, so I feel like I'm getting there.
Way to go, Jean Marie. And finally, also a very special thanks to the University of São Paulo and the Faculty of Letters and Philosophy, which has sort of enabled this technically also. So hope to connect with all of you again in one way or another in September or at some other point. And so then